If Netflix had existed in ancient Greece, the divine household atop Mount Olympus would have easily outperformed every modern drama series. Forget House of the Dragon or Succession. The real ratings juggernaut would have been the turbulent marriage of Zeus and Hera. From epic love affairs that spiraled into chaos to jealous vendettas plotted in secret chambers of the heavens, the saga of this godly couple has everything: betrayal, power struggles, revenge, and a surprising number of barnyard disguises. Yes, barnyard disguises. You see, when you are the king of the gods and wish to seduce mortals without your wife noticing, turning yourself into a swan or a bull suddenly seems like a perfectly reasonable plan. Zeus, the mighty ruler of the skies, was supposed to be the paragon of authority, thunderbolt in hand, commanding respect and order. Yet he was also the archetype of infidelity, a wandering husband whose reputation stretched as far as his lightning bolts. His wife, Hera, was a goddess of marriage and family, and she took that role very seriously. In theory, their union should have embodied perfect harmony, power and fidelity, strength and loyalty. In practice, it was anything but. What unfolded was less a divine romance and more a never-ending series of scandals, confrontations, and carefully calculated acts of vengeance. Picture Olympus not as a lofty sanctuary above the clouds, but as a glittering palace full of whispered gossip, sideways glances, and slammed golden doors. The gods and goddesses were less like celestial beings and more like celebrities at a perpetual red carpet event, their arguments echoing through the marble halls for everyone to hear. One moment, you might catch Aphrodite rolling her eyes at yet another of Zeus's escapades, while in another corner, Hermes might be betting drachmas on how long it would take before Hera discovered the latest affair. Drama was not a byproduct of divine life. It was the very oxygen they breathed. Why did the ancient Greeks tell such stories about their most powerful deities? After all, if you are going to invent gods, why not make them flawless? The answer lies in what these myths reveal. They are mirrors of human society. The Greeks understood that no household, no matter how powerful, is immune to jealousy, rivalry, and ambition. By dressing these universal struggles in divine clothing, they created narratives that were both entertaining and profoundly recognizable. Everyone knew a man who could not keep his promises, or a woman who would not forgive betrayal. The only difference was that in Olympus, the fallout involved thunderbolts, curses, and the occasional monster. But let us not pretend the stories were only moral lessons. They were also outrageous entertainment. Imagine hearing for the first time that Zeus once turned himself into a golden shower. Yes, a literal rain of gold, just to reach a woman locked in a tower. Or that Hera, upon discovering one of his mistresses, unleashed a plague upon the poor woman's entire family. These were tales designed to make you gasp, laugh, and shake your head. The ancients would sit around, listening to bards recounting these scandals with the same anticipation that we now reserve for the release of the next big streaming series. And that is exactly how we should approach the saga of Zeus and Hera today. Not as dusty relics of a forgotten religion, but as the original soap opera, the prototype for every love triangle and power struggle that has graced our screens. Their quarrels echo through centuries, shaping art, literature, and theater, and reminding us that the line between divine myth and human experience is thinner than we imagine. To know Zeus and Hera is not merely to study mythology. It is to witness the timeless spectacle of love colliding with pride, of passion eroded by betrayal, of two titans bound together yet forever at war. So settle in, because we are about to climb Olympus and peek behind the marble curtains of the most dysfunctional marriage in mythological history. There will be thunder and lightning, swans and golden rain, vengeance and reconciliation that never lasts. Most of all, there will be the sharp sting of recognition, because in every quarrel of Zeus and Hera, we hear an echo of human hearts beating with the same desires, flaws, and longings that have shaped stories since the dawn of time. Before Zeus was a thunder on a throne, He was a secret the size of a child smuggled past an anxious father with a taste for infanticide. Cronus, king of the Titans, had a habit of solving succession crises by swallowing his heirs whole, an HR policy so efficient it could only be invented by a god. One after another, Demeter, Hades, Poseidon, Hestia, and Hera slid past his teeth and vanished into the vast echo chamber of his stomach. Rhea, wife, mother, and sudden logistics expert, wrapped a stone in baby clothes and handed it over. Cronus gulped. The rock began its slow geological career. Zeus was whisked away to grow up off the corporate org chart. If origin stories leave fingerprints on destinies, Zeus's were Greco-Roman in neon, deceit as survival, rebellion as birthright, and a family dinner you would avoid forever. When Zeus came of age, he didn't file a formal complaint. He opened the father who had closed his siblings, forced Cronus to disgorge his offspring, and recruited the newly liberated crew for a war that shook the sky like a drum roll. The Titans fell. The Olympians rose. Lightning was rebranded from a weather phenomenon to a leadership style. Zeus divided the cosmos with his brothers, sky for himself, sea for Poseidon, underworld for Hades, the world's first awkward property settlement. But victory is not a personality transplant. Power magnifies. It does not repair. The Greeks understood this with painful clarity. If mortals become a little more themselves when promoted, gods become infinitely so. Thus, Zeus, protector of law, patron of oaths, champion of hospitality, acquired a resume that perfectly contradicted itself. He defended marriage as a sacred bond while treating his own as a series of scheduling conflicts. He punished perjury while promising more than a politician during festival season. It wasn't hypocrisy for hypocrisy's sake. It was the mythology of a culture that refused to draw saints in sugar. Their gods wore glory and appetite like twin cloaks. Zeus could hurl a thunderbolt straighter than any spear and still stumble the moment desire tapped his shoulder. The result is not tidy. It is, however, recognizably human. If your neighbor could shape-shift into a swan. The stories that followed have the strange glamour of dream logic. A mortal princess named Leda walks by a river. A swan glides across the water with the kind of confidence that should set off alarms. Later, there are eggs and consequences and poetry. A Phoenician girl named Europa sees a radiant bull. Unusually, polite for livestock, kneel to invite her onto his back. The Mediterranean suddenly becomes his private ferry route. Danaë, locked in a tower by a father with boundary issues, receives a suitor who arrives as a golden shower, the only weather report in history to require a parental advisory. Modern listeners sometimes blink at these transformations, but the Greeks weren't compiling police reports. They were staging metaphors, desire that ignores walls, authority disguised as innocence, power dressed in plausible deniability. If the plot mechanics feel theatrical, that's because they lived in theater. Myths weren't kept in dusty boxes, they moved. They gleamed on painted vases, marched through temple friezes, echoed in hymns, and strutted across stages. People gossiped about divine scandals the way we gossip about celebrities, with half-serious moralizing and wholehearted fascination. You could offer a sacrifice at the altar of Zeus in the morning and, by afternoon, discuss his latest outrageous disguise with the same easy breath. No one demanded consistency from a sky that brings both sunlight and storms. Why demand it from the god who runs the weather? And yet, even in their laughter, the Greeks kept one eye on the lesson. Zeus's transformations underline a simple truth. Authority will find a route. Lock the doors, raise the walls, bolt the windows. Power becomes mist, swan, bull, gold. Myth dresses the uncomfortable observation in costumes so it can slip past our defenses. It's easier to talk about a king who behaves badly if you call him a cloud. It's easier to admit that desire outruns rules when you make desire feathered and photogenic. So the stage is set. We have a ruler whose thunder scares the world and whose longings scare his household. A culture that both venerates and side-eyes him. a cosmos arranged like a palace where everyone knows the gossip before the courier does. And somewhere, just off stage, stands Hera, crown steady, gaze sharper than marble, ready to meet every disguise with scrutiny and every oath with a ledger. This is not a love story in the pastoral sense, it is a weather pattern. Heat, pressure, flash, rain. Zeus provides the storm, Hera provides the climate that remembers it. Between them, the forecast is perpetually interesting. If Olympus had corridors, the floor plan would read like a map of arguments. Voices would ricochet off marble, thunder answering thunder, while attendants pretended to polish gold that did not need polishing. The marriage of Zeus and Hera did not merely anchor the divine family, it calibrated the atmosphere. He was the sudden squall, she the barometer that never forgot. Their wedding had promised a fusion of sky and hearth, public order sealed by private fidelity. What it delivered with admirable consistency was a two-person constitution full of emergency clauses and loopholes large enough for a bull to trot through. Hera entered the union with open eyes and a crown that fit. She was revered from Samos to Argos as the guarantor of vows, the dignitary of domestic peace. Her temples were not ornamental, they were civic hardware, as central to Greek life as markets and laws. In that light, Zeus's extracurriculars were never only personal failures. Each liaison felt like a policy breach, each rumor like a constitutional amendment drafted without the queen's consent. A mortal might absorb humiliation in silence. A goddess tasked with safeguarding matrimony had to reply or abdicate her portfolio. She chose reply. Zeus, for his part, treated the household as a chessboard and desire as a knight that moves in surprising L shapes. When straightforward, wooing would not do, he became resourceful. The disguise was not a kink, it was an instrument. A swan wears innocence like a costume. A bull advertises strength without suspicion. A cloud drifts past guards with the legal status of weather. These metamorphoses were not simply eros with theatrical funding, they were assertions of prerogative. If the world draws lines, a king crosses them by changing shape. In every transformation lurked a thesis about power, that it refuses to be fenced. Of course, fences exist for reasons, and Hera knew every post and hinge. She was not omniscient, only attentive, which is more dangerous. Rumor is a kind of wind. She could read its direction on the faces of servants, in the sudden industry of couriers, in the quiet between thunderclaps. Zeus was never as hidden as he hoped. He would return with a new glitter in the eye, the faintest mist of triumph around the shoulders, and Hera would note it the way astronomers note comets. Not surprised, merely recording the orbit. Her responses ranged from icily procedural, rearranging divine seating charts with surgical cruelty, to spectacular reprisals that taught mortals what happens when you build shrines on fault lines. They tried truces. Anyone who has ever promised to behave at breakfast and broken that promise by supper will recognize the genre. For a time, Zeus played at transparency, is swearing oaths with the fluency of a politician near an election. For a time, Hera played at forbearance, deciding that dignity might be armor enough. But momentum is a true law of Olympus. The pattern reasserted itself. Rumor, denial, revelation, storm. If this sounds exhausting, remember that myths are generous to audiences. They spare us the tedious in-between, keeping only the combustible. So why didn't the marriage end? Because myth is not interested in dissolution, it is interested in friction. Zeus without Hera is weather without climate, spectacle without memory. Hera without Zeus is law without the offender who proves its necessity. Together, they model a truth older than temples. Order and appetite share a roof. The Greeks were frank about this arrangement. They did not imagine a universe supervised by impeccable supervisors. They imagined a universe run by personalities, and personalities collide. The stories do not offer therapy. They offer recognition. None of this implies that Zeus learned nothing. He learned tactics, he learned timing, He learned that even a god benefits from plausible alibis and that messengers who can keep straight faces deserve raises. He learned that storms, when repeated, must vary. Today, a drizzle of charm. Tomorrow, a downpour of theatrics, if only to keep Olympus from yawning. But reform never arrived. Reform would have ended the supply line of narrative. And narrative, not virtue, is what immortality consumes. Gods do not grow older, their stories must. Meanwhile, mortals watched and took notes. Husbands chuckled too loudly at jokes about swans. Wives sharpened their sense of pattern recognition. Priests preached hospitality in Zeus's name while privately advising brides to cultivate a memory as long as Hera's. The theater made a feast of it. Comedians winked, tragedians frowned, vase painters split the difference and drew everything. There is a reason these tales traveled so well. Everyone has lived in a house where thunder is not strictly meteorological. Picture then a quiet evening after one of those storms. The sky has rinsed itself clean. Olympus glows as if someone polished the weather. Zeus paces, already half distracted by tomorrow's temptations. Hera sits with the poise of a verdict that needs no gavel. Between them hangs the air of an armistice that knows its own expiration date. They are not reconciled. They are resumed. The palace sleeps on the surface, but the foundations hum with the energy of a pattern older than law. In that hum, you can hear the coming chapters, disguises perfected, reprisals refined, the great machine of legend gathering speed. To see Zeus clearly, you have to widen the frame beyond the scandal sheet and look at the civic billboard. He was not only the rogue of Olympus, he was its warranty. Judges invoked him before verdicts, hosts poured the first cup in his honor to sanctify hospitality. Athletes raced for wreaths beneath his temples, their sweat a kind of liturgy. When a storm split the horizon, farmers did not just check the sky, they checked Zeus's mood. Greek life leaned on him the way a city leans on its aqueducts, not because the architecture is flawless, but because without it nothing flows. The Greeks carried this double awareness like a coin with two honest faces. On one side gleamed reverence, hymns, sacrifices, columns lifting prayer into air. On the other shone irreverence, jokes, winks, and anecdotes about swans, bulls, and the weather behaving suspiciously like a suitor. They did not find the contradiction embarrassing. They found it accurate. If the sky can bless a harvest in the morning and flatten a ship by evening, then the sky's king may also be the guarantor of oaths at noon and the breaker of one by dusk. Myth did not tidy that tension. It put it on stage with good lighting and sold out the house. His affairs, catalogued with the zeal of archivists and the glee of gossips, were not narrative litter. They were infrastructure. From those unions sprang the figures who populate the grand avenues of Greek story. Perseus navigating mirrors and monsters. Helen, whose beauty drafted navies. Minos writing laws and labyrinths. Hercules converting impossible into accomplished 12 times running. Call it a genealogy of consequences. Zeus didn't just complicate marriages, he complicated maps, succession lines, border disputes, and the curriculum of future poets. Each liaison was a pebble dropped into the pool of time. The ripples reached distant shores where new legends were waiting to be named. None of this happened in a vacuum. Hera's presence turned ripples into waves. She was a necessary resistance, the equal and opposite force that made every story earn its motion. Without her scrutiny, Zeus's adventures would read like entries in a travel diary. With it, they become trials. She is the gravity in the system, ensuring that what goes up in exhilaration must come down in consequence. If Zeus supplies the spark, Hera supplies the oxygen that makes it visible, heat, light, hazard. The old playwright's rule applies, conflict reveals character, and Olympus was a theater that never closed. Even so, the culture refused to let Hera's anger or Zeus's appetites be the final word. The point was not to flatten them into stock figures, saint and sinner, scold and rake. The point was to watch big energies collide and see what truths scatter out. Does power tend to excuse itself? The myths nod. Do vows mean less to the powerful than to those bound by them? The myths wince. Is endurance a kind of authority all its own? Hera's jawline says yes. And under everything hums the oldest admission: desire is a weather system. It does not obey the outlook you filed yesterday. In art, you can see the double vision crystallized. The pediments show Zeus enthroned, symmetrical, serene, geometry pretending to be ethics. On vases, the same god appears mid-pursuit, cloak flaring, eyes bright with mischief, ethics pretending to be geometry. Playwrights built choruses to praise him and punchlines to prod him. Philosophers recruited him as a metaphor and then scolded the metaphor for behaving like a man. The result is not confusion, but texture. A flat god can be believed or disbelieved. A complicated god can be lived with. Imagine the end of a long festival day at Olympia. Smoke thins in the evening air. The last hymn drifts like a thread of gold. A magistrate folds the oath tablet and thinks about his daughter's wedding. A runner touches the olive wreath as if it were a cloud within reach. Somewhere far above, the marble palace glows, the way poured milk takes light, and a figure paces its galleries, restless as always. He is planning, of course. Planning comes as naturally to him as thunder follows heat. A messenger will be summoned. A disguise will be tailored. A story will be put into motion that mortals will recite for centuries, arguing over what it means while secretly enjoying that it happens at all. What then is the verdict on Zeus? There isn't one. That is the verdict. He is a complete sentence that refuses a period. King and culprit, covenant and loophole, discipline and impulse, held together not by logic but by scale. The Greeks did not give us an example to imitate or avoid. They gave us a weather report that never stops being true. Storms will form where heat meets pressure. In the chapters ahead, those storms will name names: Leda and Europa, Danaë, and the households that tremble when gods play at being men. Hera will answer with memory sharp as law, and you, listening, will recognize the climate, because however high Olympus stands, its weather reaches the ground. If Zeus is the weather, Hera is climate, steadier, stricter, and far less impressed by theatrics. Long before gossip about swans and bulls cluttered the heavens, she stood as a central pillar of Greek life, patron of marriage, custodian of the household, silent witness to the vows that mortals made with shaking hands and hopeful hearts. Her temples did not merely punctuate landscapes, they organized them. A city that honored Hera announced itself as a place where families tried, however imperfectly, to hold. Brides brought tokens, priests recited blessings, and neighbors measured success not in thunderbolts thrown, but in quarrels weathered. In such a world, Hera's crown was not jewelry, it was jurisdiction. Myth, being the world's oldest stage, gave her a proper entrance, not as a side character orbiting a famous husband, but as a queen whose authority does not require endorsement from anyone, least of all a spouse inclined to wander. Born of Cronus and Rhea, sister to Zeus, Hera carried the same primordial credentials as every Olympian heavyweight. Yet unlike the gods of craft or war or the sea, talents that can be put away at night, her portfolio was perpetual. People do not stop being married when the festival ends. They go home and try again tomorrow. Hera lived in that again, in the daily repairs, the seasonal recalibrations, the quiet decision to stay. No surprise then that storytellers gave her an aura of iron poise and a gaze that could inventory a room in one pass. And then she married the sky. To call their union symbolic is almost too modest. Zeus and Hera promised a merger of force and form, flash and framework, spectacle and statute. The ceremony may have glowed. The honeymoon forecast was already mixed. For Hera, matrimony was not romance with better costumes. It was a public office. Every time a mortal pair clasped hands before an altar, her name was the signature on the document, which is why Zeus's extracurricular adventures, amusing to poets, lucrative for painters, translated for Hera as constitutional insults. She was not simply embarrassed, she was professionally compromised. Imagine being the divine seal on fidelity while the king of the gods, your husband, treats fidelity as a polite suggestion. Yet the myths resist turning Hera into a caricature of grievance. What gives her dimension is not the volume of her anger, but the discipline behind it. She is not omniscient, she is attentive. Rumor travels faster than lightning, and Hera reads it the way sailors read wind. By the tilt of a servant's voice, the new zeal of messengers, the slightly too casual stride of a husband who thinks he is returning as weather when, in fact, he is arriving as evidence. Her silence is not surrender, it is suspense. She counts before she acts, and when she acts, the action has levels. A seating chart becomes a sentence. An exile doubles as a memo. The queen does not rage, she edits. Still, no posture of dignity can insulate a person, god or mortal, from the humiliation of repeated betrayal. The poets knew this and sharpened their lines accordingly. They showed Hera as majestic and wounded, ceremonial and cornered, blessing weddings at noon and plotting deterrence by dusk. If that sounds contradictory, it is because marriage is contradictory. Two people bring sovereign wills to a shared territory and, on their braver days, call the border negotiations love. Hera, patron and practitioner, embodies a paradox. She is a theorist forced to test her theory against a husband who keeps trying to turn the lab into a carnival. It would be easy to stop here, to cast Hera as a celestial scold who spoils everyone's fun. But that reading is thin, and thin readings rarely survive centuries. The Greeks, who never confused clarity with simplicity, built a richer silhouette. They revered Hera because without her gravity, society drifts. She lends ceremonies their weight and gives promises a place to land. Even those who snickered at tales of Zeus's disguises knew that Hera's constancy made those jokes possible. Comedy requires a straight face somewhere, and she supplied it at scale. If Zeus thinks in lightning, Hera thinks in ledgers. One impulse electrifies, the other remembers. Together, they make a system that mortals recognize immediately. Charisma colliding with order, appetite negotiating with rule, the loudness of power meeting the quietness of consequence. In that collision, Hera does not vanish. She clarifies. Her dignity refracts Zeus's glamour into something legible, not just scandal, but cost. And that is where we find her at the start of this chapter. A sovereign with a long view, a custodian of bonds who wakes each day to steward a vow the sky keeps testing. She could abdicate, but abdication is not in her vocabulary. She could forgive without remainder, but that would betray her office. Instead, she holds the line, not out of pettiness, but out of principle, as if reminding the cosmos that promises mean what they cost. If she sometimes strikes hard, it is because soft answers rarely move thunder. If she sometimes schemes, it is because open force belongs to others. Hera's power is the power of the unblinking gaze, the unshakable ledger, the unmislaid memory. The audience, then as now, leans in. They are not waiting for a tantrum, they are waiting for a demonstration of restraint, of strategy, of what a queen can do when the weather refuses to keep the treaty. The next pages will oblige them, but before we watch consequences flower, it is worth pausing with this first impression. Hera as necessary seriousness in a world that adores spectacle. Hera as the architecture that keeps Olympus from collapsing under its own fireworks. The bards love to say Hera was jealous, as if a single word could hold a palace. Jealousy makes for an easy chorus. It does not make for an accurate ledger. What she felt was older and colder than spite, the pain of a public office made ridiculous in public. Every time Zeus descended in feathers or fog, he did not merely embarrass a wife, he undermined a queen. Each liaison threatened to mint a cult and carve another private doorway into the house that Hera was supposed to keep whole. She could not arrest the weather, so she managed the consequences. Semele learned what consequences look like when desire outruns caution. A mortal with a heartbeat tuned to worship, she believed the god loved her. Hera believed the god loved the chase. Disguised as a confidant, Hera's best costumes were always conversational. She asked a softly devastating question. If he truly is who he says, why hasn't he shown you? Semele asked. Zeus arrived unmasked, and pure divinity does what lightning always does to unshielded flesh. The poets call it tragedy. Hera would have called it proof. Out of the ashes came Dionysus, rescued and stitched into Zeus's thigh, a mythic footnote that would one day host its own festivals. The lesson was not gentle. When the king of the gods makes private promises, the bill is public. With Io, the theater grew wider. She was a priestess of Hera, piety with excellent timing, and Zeus wrapped the affair in cattle's skin, turning the girl into a cow with the kind of improvisation that suggests practice. Hera asked for the cow as a gift, the way a prosecutor asks for evidence. Argus with 100 eyes became the security detail. Hermes with 100 tricks removed him. Hera's reply took the form of a gadfly that turned the world into a maze. It's tempting to laugh. Swans, cows, an insect with a vendetta, but the mileage is the point. Io's story is what happens when a single moment with a powerful man becomes a continent you have to cross on foot. Then there is Heracles, whose name means the glory of Hera, a title that reads like Destiny's sarcasm. From the cradle, she contested him, snakes in the night that he strangled with infant hands, a madness that sent him into an unspeakable act, and the famous labors, 12 sentences handed down by a queen who understood how to turn shame into structure. Clean this stable, fetch that golden fruit, wrestle what no one else can. Each task, impossible until it wasn't, transformed punishment into a curriculum. The irony is undeniable. Hera's resistance did not erase the child. It refined the hero. If Zeus supplied the raw material, Hera supplied the forge. In all these tales, Zeus appears untouched, the author of storms who rarely gets wet. That imbalance is not a flaw of the stories, but one of their subjects. The Greeks knew the shape of power well enough to draw it without flattering it. Lightning strikes where it wants. The burned learn the lesson. Hera strikes where she can, which is at the perimeter, at the lovers, at the offspring, at the symbols that bloom after Zeus has moved on. Critics call this cruelty. Hera might call it jurisdiction. In a universe where the executive refuses restraint, the judiciary becomes inventive. Still, there are moments, glimpses through the marble, when the mask slips and we see the human outline beneath the crown. Hera's punishments are meticulous because wounded dignity prefers precision. She exiles instead of explodes, edits instead of screams, calculates instead of begs. The theater makes this look villainous because theater likes its shadows sharp. But the audience, then and now, recognizes something closer to home. The way injury travels when it cannot travel upward. The way institutions harden when they are laughed at. The way a promise phrase when only one party is tasked with keeping it. Did Hera ever win? Myth is stubborn about victories. It prefers continuations. Yet she won something that matters in literature. She ensured that the price of Zeus's pleasures became plot. That private appetites acquired public meaning. Without her, the swans would be spectacles and the bulls curiosities. With her, they become trials, geographies, histories. A queen cannot stop the weather. She can insist that it be recorded. To see Hera only as the fury that follows a disguised god is to miss her real dominion. She did not merely react to Olympus, she organized it. Where Zeus ruled by voltage, Hera ruled by vectors, alliances, procedures, traditions that outlive the day's spectacle. There are stories in which she appears not as a scold, but as a strategist, a queen whose instruments are patience and precision. If Zeus is a storm crossing the sea, Hera is the coastline that decides which waves matter. The most audacious proof of her will is the rebellion that almost worked. Tired of Zeus's arrogance and improvisations, Hera conspired with Poseidon, Apollo, and Athena to bind the king of gods. The plan succeeded long enough to demonstrate its seriousness. Zeus in chains, the sky's thunder still like a sentence interrupted mid-verb. For a breath, Olympus glimpsed a different constitution, one in which the queen's calculation could correct the king's appetite. It did not last. Thetis summoned Briareus, the hundred-handed, and the bonds broke like bad precedent overturned. Zeus punished Hera in a theater of humiliation, hung from the heavens, shackled with golden chains, anvils dragging at her feet. An image so stark it stains memory. Yet, even in defeat, her rebellion entered the canon as a rare moment when Olympus trembled from the top down, proof that Hera's courage ran deeper than her grievance. Open revolt was an exception. Cunning was the rule. In Homer's Iliad, Hera does not lift a spear so much as she moves entire fronts with a gesture. She favors the Greeks, and when brute advocacy will not do, she takes the scenic route through seduction. With the help of Aphrodite, she becomes distraction incarnate, luring Zeus into a haze of desire and sleep so battle can tilt the way she prefers. It is a scene often told with a smile, but beneath the comic varnish lies the same lesson as the chains. Hera wields the tools available to her, whether they look like fetters or perfume. Power wears many costumes. Hers include patience stitched in silk. Among mortals, her portfolio was not gossip, but governance. The Heraion at Samos towered over sea and field, a rectangle of columns announcing that households mattered enough to earn stone. Brides left offerings, cities held festivals, and the Heraia, athletic contests for women, inscribed her name on bodies in motion. These rituals did not erase the myth's humiliations, but they reframed the queen as more than the sum of them. In civic memory, she was the warranty stamped onto vows, the patron who outlasted scandal because someone had to. A society that asked families to endure required a goddess who did the same. And yet the paradox persisted. The might of a throne paired with the helplessness of a wife who cannot resign. That tension produces Hera's most human silhouette. She has jurisdiction, but not relief, strategy, but not serenity. She knows the rules because she wrote them and discovers, to her anguish, that they bind her too. It is tempting to call this tragic. It may be more exact to call it adult. The Greeks, masters of double vision, could honor her festival in the morning and watch a play that mocked her marriage at night, understanding that both responses protect something true. Reverence keeps the roof on, laughter lets the windows open. The theater, greedy for contrast, often sharpened her into shadow, jealous, vengeful, implacable. But audiences felt the weight beneath the edge. They recognized a dignity that refused to evaporate under heat. They recognized the cost of being the world's custodian of promises while living with the universe's most spectacular promise breaker. If Hera sometimes plotted, it was because plots were the grammar available to those denied proclamations. If she sometimes punished, it was because boundaries enforced themselves only in stories. In life, someone must draw the line. So the chapter closes with Hera not as a foil, but as a force. She is the queen who dared the coup, the tactician who could outmaneuver thunder, the patron whose temples disciplined memory. She is also the woman suspended between office and insult, holding the architecture of marriage steady while the sky shakes it for sport. Greek myth never rescues her from that bind. It elevates her inside it. Perhaps that is why she endures. Zeus dazzles. Hera clarifies. He writes weather. She writes history's margins where consequences are tallied and paid. The Greeks did not imagine Olympus as a tidy couple's retreat. They designed a dynasty. And dynasties have children, legitimate, semi-legitimate, loudly rumored, and each child is a plot line with a pulse. If Zeus and Hera were the storm and the climate, their offspring were the weather reports. Gusts of glory, microbursts of scandal, clear skies briefly before someone remembered a grudge. On feast days, the palace looked like a family business that had gone public, complete with departments, rivalries, and a board chair who occasionally arrived in the form of a bird. Start with the official line, the children of Zeus and Hera who lend the marriage its public face. Ares, war as momentum rather than strategy, strode through Olympus with the restless gait of a soldier who loves the sound of metal more than the meaning of victory. He treated battle like music. Louder is better. Across the hall stood Athena, Zeus's daughter without Hera, born inconveniently out of her father's head, war as geometry and grammar. If Ares was drumline, Athena was blueprint. Their rivalry made every battlefield a family reunion, brawn and brain arguing over who gets the credit for the same win. No wonder mortals prayed to one before marching and to the other before planning. Then there was Hephaestus, the god who proved that craftsmanship can outshine charisma. Some versions say Hera conceived him alone in a fit of grim pride. Others say he arrived in the usual way and was thrown from the sky for being imperfectly divine. Either way, the fall left a limp and a lesson. Olympus could be cruel about aesthetics. Hephaestus answered with a workshop that thundered more reliably than Zeus. Furnaces breathing, anvils ringing, inventions compiled like apologies no one asked him to make. When Hera once sat on a throne he had forged and discovered it was also a trap. The court learned that disability is not the same as helplessness. Hephaestus negotiated his return to Olympus the way great engineers always do, by making himself indispensable. Hebe poured the wine, youth in a dress code, grace moving from goblet to god. It was a role both ceremonial and intimate, and it kept Hera's name in every toast. Until Zeus, with the effortless cruelty of a man who believes substitutions improve everything, installed Ganymede, a mortal boy turned immortal cupbearer, handsome enough to make Olympus applaud and Hera's mouth become a straight line. The demotion of a daughter to make room for a favored outsider was not just a change in staffing, it was a memo about where the king believed privilege should flow. Somewhere in the applause you could hear the sound of a queen adding columns in a mental ledger. Eileithyia, midwife of the divine, presided over births with hands that knew when to hurry and when to wait. Waiting, in myth, is a weapon. Hera learned that if you cannot prevent a child, you can complicate his arrival. Stories whisper of labors stretched thin as thread, of doors barred to Eileithyia until the timing worked in favor of Hera's politics. Mortals discovered theology the hard way. Even the hour of a child can be negotiated by gods with long memories. Around these legitimate rooms swirled a constellation of Zeus's other children, each one a small earthquake for Hera's authority. Apollo and Artemis, born to Leto after Hera made the world itself inhospitable to the mother. Hermes, quick with words and quicker with theft. Athena, the aforementioned migraine-made flesh. Dionysus, rescued from fire and sewn into a father. Hera did not forget any of them. How could she? Cities built festivals around their names. Every new cult was another balcony overlooking the central palace. Another proof that Zeus's private impulses printed public currency. The politics of such a household cannot be overstated. Ares wanted glory now. Athena wanted a plan that would still look wise in a generation. Hephaestus wanted the contract in writing. Hermes wanted the loophole. Apollo wanted hymns in the right meter. Artemis wanted distances respected. Dionysus wanted the rules to dissolve into dancing and then reassemble as something kinder. Hera wanted order. And Zeus, well, Zeus wanted everything, which is a management style but not a policy. To live in that family was to understand the sentence the Greeks kept writing across their art. Power is hereditary, but harmony is not. A throne can be bequeathed, legitimacy cannot. The gods did not solve this. They dramatized it, which is sometimes the best an old culture can do with an older problem. And somewhere at the end of the banquet, as the last libation smoked on the floor, Hera would glance down the table at faces that looked like her husband from certain angles and feel the palace tilt slightly towards tomorrow's argument. On the days when Olympus resembled a staff meeting, two names turned the agenda into an argument: Ares and Athena. They were the twin faces of conflict, siblings by circumstance and opponents by principle. Ares loved war the way a drummer loves volume. Strike, strike again. Let the air learn who is in charge. He arrived on battlefields like a gust that had found a reason. Steel sang, dust rose, glory tasted like metal. Across the same plane, Athena moved as if the ground were graph paper. She preferred distance, angles, timing, the hush before the strike, the map folded inside a commander's skull. Mortals learned quickly that praying to Ares without consulting Athena produced heroic obituaries. Praying to Athena without admitting Ares existed produced plans that looked brilliant from the safety of a porch. Victory, when it finally chose a side, usually found both gods waiting to claim credit, which may be why generals acquired the habit of thanking strategy first and momentum louder. The quarrel between them was not petty, it was structural. Ares insisted that courage is a quantity and quantities grow. Athena insisted that courage is a quality and qualities must be placed. He wanted the heat of contact. She wanted the chill of calculation. He surged. She shaped. Zeus, who loved result and disliked nuance, let the sibling rivalry supply both the fire and the blueprint, which is another way of saying he let his children fight because their competition made him look successful. In the epics, when Ares is wounded, he howls like a city. When Athena speaks, armies adjust their feet. You can hear two philosophies of power trying to occupy the same sentence. If Ares and Athena fought over how war should look, Hephaestus fought for the right to look like a god at all. One version says Hera bore him without Zeus, a declaration of independence that fate answered with a limp. Another version says Zeus, dissatisfied with imperfection, threw the infant from the sky, gifting him both gravity and exile in one motion. However the fall began, it ended in fire. Volcanoes for workshops, anvils for punctuation, hammers for the grammar of invention. Hephaestus built palaces that other gods merely lived in. He forged weapons that made legends feel underdressed. His smoke wrote the first drafts of thunder, his bellows turned ore into argument. And he did not forget. When Hera once settled onto a throne, he had crafted a gift, a reconciliation, an apology depending on the angle. She discovered it was also a trap, metal that obeyed only its maker. Courtiers tried not to stare. Olympus tried not to gasp. The crippled god had welded consequence to furniture. He set terms for her release that read like a labor contract and a family drama at once. Recognition, restoration, a seat that was no longer merely symbolic. The lesson he taught his parents is the one artisans teach every age. Charisma burns fast. Craft burns steady. In a palace of lightning, the engineer decides where the light falls. If Hephaestus negotiated his place with tools, Hebe held hers with grace. As cupbearer, she walked the elegant circuit from crater to throne, pouring youth as a service, turning hospitality into choreography. Every pour placed Hera's daughter at the center of divine conviviality. Every libation made family appear functional. Then Zeus saw Ganymede, a shepherd boy whose beauty could embarrass adjectives, and the circuit was redrawn. The boy ascended, the girl was replaced, immortality added a new face to its guest list. Poets called it rapture, vase painters called it composition, Hera called it something you do not say aloud in a temple. A minor change in roles became a major change in temperature. To appoint a lover where a daughter stood is not merely a preference, it is a policy. Hebe adapted, goddesses with long resumes do. But the message seeded itself in the household. In Zeus's world, talent and affection share a highway, and traffic rules favored the driver. Ganymede's presence was both a compliment to beauty and a footnote on legitimacy. He poured impeccably. He also poured as a reminder that merit is not the only path to the dais. Hera's silence on the matter had the crispness of paper being folded and set aside for later use. All these skirmishes, Ares against Athena, Hephaestus against lineage, Hebe against replacement dressed as improvement, converge on a single fact of divine life. Inheritance is less about blood than about leverage. Zeus gave the family its surge. Hera gave it its ledger. The children learned to choose instruments. Some chose speed, some chose shape, some chose a chair that bites back. The palace learned to breathe through the debates. And mortals, peering up at frescoes and listening to bards, recognized themselves with a start. Their houses had smaller thrones but the same problems. The warrior who will not plan, the planner who will not charge, the craftsperson everyone needs when the hinges fail, the favored newcomer who turns tradition into an uncomfortable mirror. Even in heaven, succession is an art practice in a room full of feelings. Zeus presided, pleased to be the father of both drumbeat and design. Hera presided, determined to weigh each gift against its cost. The children took positions that sounded like personalities and turned out to be policies. By the time the cups were emptied and the torches smoked, Olympus had voted without voting. Conflict would continue, family would contain it, barely. Dynasties are not only made in bedrooms and battlefields, they are scheduled in delivery rooms, which in Olympus means the schedule is a kind of weapon. When Leto carried twins by Zeus, Hera did not forbid birth, she forbade land. No place on earth, she decreed, should accept the laboring mother. Islands refused. Cities looked at the sky and decided ceilings were safer than favors. At last, a rock that floated, Delos, rootless enough to escape the rule, offered itself as a loophole. There, with Eileithyia finally permitted to arrive, Artemis came first, and then stood as midwife to her brother Apollo. The story reads like logistics poetry. Jurisdiction denied, jurisdiction outmaneuvered, jurisdiction updated, fact rap. Greek cults later honored Delos as a sacred birthplace, process became shrine. Hera's control over timing mattered. An heir born a day earlier can seize opportunities a day late cannot. Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, thus became Hera's softest instrument, not a thunderbolt, a delay. You cannot cancel Zeus's desire after the fact. You can price it. A prolonged labor is a surcharge. A barred door is interest. The Greeks understood the message because they lived it. Administration is how power survives its embarrassment. Around these births swirled children who would redraw maps. Hermes arrived quick-tongued and quicker-fingered, stealing cattle by lunchtime and inventing the lyre by dinner, which is a strong first day for anyone's resume. He became the god of thresholds, messages, bargains, lies that are almost true. And the palace discovered that a dynasty needs not only soldiers and judges, but also a courier who understands the difference between a rule and its wording. Deadpan aside, in Olympus, compliance is mostly knowing which door is technically a window. Apollo grew into sunlight with edges, music, prophecy, plague, medicine, a portfolio that reads like a university catalog and an HR nightmare. Artemis guarded wild distances and the integrity of boundaries. She was a yes that arrives as a no. Together, they brought the kind of prestige that turns rivals into worshippers. Hera did not love their existence. She respected their utility. The empire of Zeus looked more persuasive with a radiant sun and a relentless daughter standing at the horizon like arguments you cannot refute. Then there was Dionysus, the god who entered the world through a loophole and made loopholes into liturgy. Born of Semele, who burned, rescued as a fetus and sewn into Zeus's thigh, Dionysus reintroduced chaos as healing. Wine, theater, ecstasy, the unbuttoning of masks. His cults welcomed those whom the palace forgot to seat properly. If Apollo is order sung, Dionysus is disorder that sings back. For Hera, he was an old wound conducting a new orchestra. Proof that private scandals ferment into public faiths. For mortals, he was a holiday that argued for mercy. Hera did not lose every round, nor did she seek only vetoes. Some victories were the disguise of ceremony. When Heracles completed his labors and was lifted to godhood, Olympus staged a reconciliation that looked like a wedding because it was one. Hebe, cupbearer and daughter of Hera, married the newly apotheosized hero. The union read as diplomacy engraved on joy. An enemy refiled his family. A troublemaker converted into a pillar. You can call it forgiveness. Hera would call it conversion of liabilities into assets. Callback. In a palace where chairs have been known to bite back, she preferred contracts that do not need teeth. So, the ledger fills. Zeus supplies protagonists like a sky that never runs out of weather. Hera writes the margins where costs are counted. Leto's exile teaches that even geography can turn partisan. Hermes professionalizes ambiguity. Apollo and Artemis make magnificence look like policy. Dionysus builds a backdoor and calls it grace. Hebe's marriage to Heracles proves that sometimes the only way to end a feud is to make it a festival. By the time the torches gutter and the last hymn loosens into conversation, the household understands its own physics. Inheritance is not a straight line. It is a negotiation that never ends. A dynasty, even a divine one, is not a story about who begets whom, but about who absorbs whom. Scandals into cults, enemies into in-laws, delays into destinies. Olympus remains what it has always been, a family business with too many departments and one guiding principle. Thunder announces, ledgers endure. The story opens on a beach where history pretends to be a picnic. Europa, a Phoenician princess with a basket and a morning to spare, meets a bull that is clearly read to the room. He is gentle, luminous, the kind of animal that makes sculptors reconsider their career choices. In a world where omens traveled faster than ships, a dazzling bull kneeling for a ride should have triggered committee meetings. Instead, Europa laughed, climbed on, and the Mediterranean became a runway. Deadpan. Olympus has always excelled at maritime logistics. From a distance, the scene reads like romance in pastoral lighting. From up close, it is geopolitics on hooves. The bull was Zeus in another of his plausible costumes, trading the paperwork of persuasion for the efficiency of disguise. The sea, which had not been consulted, complied. They slashed the waves towards Crete, an island that did not ask for a rebrand and received one anyway. By the time Europa touched Cretan sand, the myth had already begun converting itself into policy. She would become queen, her sons would seed dynasties, and the island would take its place as a compass point in Greek imagination, east of innocence, west of regret. Hera is not on stage, but you can feel her offstage arithmetic. The ledger we have met before reopens. Private appetite, public cost. A princess disappears, a new court materializes, treaties will be needed, cults will be founded. Zeus prefers the spark. Hera remembers the fire code. In a household where compliance often means knowing which door is technically a window, an abduction that becomes a coronation is the kind of window auditors notice. Europa's children carry Thunder's surname without asking. Minos grows into a king who treats law the way other men treat rumors. He expects it to arrive when invoked. He descends to the shore, prays, and Poseidon answers with a flawless white bull, the divine stamp on mortal authority. Here the script pauses long enough to admire its own symmetry. A bull began the romance, a bull legitimizes the throne. Deadpan. The Cretan ministry of symbolism was never underfunded. Minos, impressed by the gift, is expected to sacrifice it back. He does not. In myths, as in audits, what you keep has a way of keeping you. The unpaid debt metastasizes into the architecture of a nightmare. The borrowed bull becomes the root of a curse. A queen's desire turns to catastrophe. A child is born who is also a labyrinth's argument. Engineers are called, which is how Daedalus enters the story like a clause that fixes a careless promise. He builds the labyrinth, a structure so patient it makes hunger look like procedure. If Zeus's transformations are a sprint, Daedalus's corridors are a marathon that bends back on itself. The bull that once ferried a princess now echoes in hoofbeats below the palace. Crete's glory includes a basement it cannot quite explain. And yet Minos is not a villain out of central casting. He is a case study in what happens when charisma, divine or otherwise, sets the terms and mortals must govern the consequences. He codifies justice, polices the seas, and posthumously becomes one of the judges of the dead. The same island that stages a scandal becomes a courthouse. The same family that absorbed a thunderbolt becomes a bureaucracy. Myth does not blush at contradiction, it staffs it. Europa herself, the original passenger, receives honors that crystallize the rationalized memory of a messy beginning. Zeus gives her gifts. The world gives her a continent's name. That is how Greek stories often tidy the ledger. They turn the scene you can't quite defend into the map you can't quite ignore. If the method feels familiar, it is because we live in cities named after victories that were not negotiations and festivals that began as apologies with better music. What of Hera? She does not descend in fury. She does not snap the thread. She lets time do what time does best: convert heat into structure. A kingdom that owes its crown to a disguised bull must maintain an unusual level of decorum. Crete obliges, performing orders so meticulously that you can hear the distant clink of a queen's satisfaction. She cannot stop the weather, but she can insist the forecast becomes law. By evening, the beach is only a beach again. The basket is empty. The tide has erased the footprints. The bull is a rumor receding into spray. On the horizon, an island glows, newly important, newly complicated. If you listened only for romance, you heard a love story with smooth lighting. If you listened for politics, you heard a founding myth disguised as a ride. And if you listened for Hera, you heard nothing at all. Just the quiet scratch of a ledger closing another page while a new chapter of institutions begins to write itself. If Europa's ride to Crete turned courtship into cartography, Danaë shows how a romance can become a supply chain. Her father, King Acrisius, locked her in a bronze room to keep prophecy from maturing, an architectural approach to fate management. Zeus answered with the most convenient workaround in weather history: a golden rain that bypassed walls and policies in a single shimmer. Deadpan. The palace compliance office did not have a form for precipitation-based courtship. A child was conceived, Perseus, and the scandal was promptly created. Acrisius sealed mother and baby in a chest and outsourced the problem to the sea, which has a long record of accepting unwanted packages. The current delivered them to Seriphos, where a fisherman, Dictys, opened the chest and, inadvertently, a narrative franchise. Years later, his king, Polydectes, decided Danaë would make an excellent queen and Perseus an excellent obstacle. The boy was sent to fetch Medusa's head, a task so fatal it functioned as a polite execution. But heroism thrives on impractical requests. Athena lent a mirror-bright shield and Hermes a blade. Perseus learned to fight a monster by refusing to look directly at it, which is also how politics often works. He snipped the Gorgon from history, weaponized her gaze, and returned carrying a portable veto. Deadpan. The island's risk committee rated petrification as a non-standard but effective conflict resolution tool. Notice the conversion rate. A private tryst becomes a Gorgon policy. A reign undone becomes a kingdom reformed. A bronze room spawns a mythic mirror that warns citizens, beware rulers who fear their own grandchildren. Along every step, you can feel an absent queen's arithmetic. Hera cannot reverse the rain, but the ledger will record the cost. A chest, an island's coup, a new class of hero whose victories arrive with long supply lists, swords, sandals, special permissions, gods on retainer, desire generates protagonists, administration files the receipts. Now shift the scene to a riverbank where swans usually mind their own business. Leda walks, the world glows, and a swan glides into the frame with suspicious charisma. This is Zeus again, submitting an ornithological resume. The encounter yields eggs. Myth prefers poetry to obstetrics, from which hatch an arrangement that will one day draft navies. Helen, face of 1,000 ships. The Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, twin patrons of sailors and sudden rescues, and in some tellings, Clytemnestra, reminder that marital arithmetic can add murder. Deadpan. Eggs remain a controversial filing category in royal maternity paperwork. What looks like pastoral romance is actually coalition building with feathers. Helen's beauty becomes an interstate problem. To Odysseus proposes the oath of Tyndareus. All suitors swear to defend the winner's marriage. It is an elegant, preemptive treaty that functions like many treaties until the first good story breaks it. When Paris abducts Helen, the oath activates and Greece discovers it has assembled a maritime alliance out of flirtation, vanity, and paperwork. A swan's afternoon has turned into 10 years of war and an export boom in tragic poetry. Mock epic flourish. Thus was logistics born from plumage. Hera's hand is again indirect but legible. She did not choose the swan. She reads the aftercare, the oath, the ships, the councils under wind-furled sails. These are the procedural shadows of Zeus's brightness. Hera's sphere is the part of love stories that happens in committee. Who signs, who swears, who pays. The queen's temper in myth gets headlines, but her patient bookkeeping writes the institutions that endure even when the feathers are gone. Between Danaë and Leda, you can sketch a curriculum for the ancient world. Lesson 1. Walls are excellent at stopping mortal visitors and excellent at admitting weather. Lesson 2. If you cannot prevent an event, you can price it, delay a birth, bind suitors in an oath, turn a monster into an instrument. Lesson 3. The private becomes public at scale. A king's fear manufactures a hero. A god's costume manufactures a fleet. Heroes behead problems and bring the head home. Queens make sure the head is cataloged, boxed, and labeled "Do Not Stare." And the callbacks multiply. The bull that ferried Europa legitimizes Minos. The swan that visited Leda legitimizes an armada. The shower that visited Danaë legitimizes a new doctrine of looking indirectly at terror. Each disguise seeds an infrastructure. Each infrastructure requires maintenance. Somewhere off stage, a certain chair that once bit back reminds us that tools remember their makers, and consequences, once forged, develop habits of their own. By dusk, the river looks innocent again. Leda's footprints blur, and the swan is only a rumor with perfect feathers. On Seriphos, a fisherman hangs his net to dry and does not know he helped calibrate the balance of a world. In palaces and temples, people repeat names. Perseus, Helen, the Dioscuri, as if they were prayers, and perhaps they are. Petitions for rescue, for beauty not to devour peace, for monsters to be useful after they are terrible. Olympus keeps its secret, earth codifies them, thunder improvises, ledgers endure. The file is labeled Alcmene, and the first line reads like a bureaucrat's joke. Identity of father complicated. Zeus chose not feathers or hooves this time, but imitation, slipping into the shape of Alcmene's husband, Amphitryon, and stretching one night into 3 as if time were an elastic clause. Deadpan. Olympus never met a timesheet it couldn't reinterpret. In the morning, the real Amphitryon returned, slightly puzzled to find his welcome so enthusiastic and the candles already melted. 9 months later, Alcmene bore twins, Iphicles, son of Amphitryon, and Heracles, son of the sky pretending to be a man. 1 womb, 2 jurisdictions. Hera had already learned that she could not unmake events that thunder had set in motion, but she could schedule their meanings. Zeus boasted, never a good idea, that a child of his blood, born that very day, would rule the house of Perseus. Hera answered without volume, only calendar control. She sent Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to delay Alcmene's labor and accelerate the delivery of Eurystheus in Argos. When the decree's clock chimed, the firstborn claimant to destiny was not the infant with lightning's eyes, but a perfectly mortal baby with very punctual timing. The ripples are administrative genius. By making Eurystheus king first, Hera ensured that Heracles, the very emblem of Zeus's extracurricular pride, would grow up subject to another man's orders. Power, redirected by a bracketed date. Deadpan. Never underestimate what a well-timed signature can do to a demigod's career path. The result is famous enough to be mistaken for nature. Moi Hei Lao Chong. Monsters to be throttled, mares to be cleaned up after, apples to be fetched from an orchard that behaves like a jurisdictional dispute. Each task imposed by Eurystheus, each victory a reminder that even genius muscles report to calendars. The births themselves stage a small theater of cunning and counter-cunning. Eileithyia sat at the door with her limbs crossed in a ritual knot, binding Alcmene's womb with sympathetic magic. Inside, the woman labored without progress. Outside, the goddess rehearsed what every clerk knows, that a cue can be weaponized. Salvation arrived in the form of Galanthus, a maid whose improvisational ethics deserve a hymn. She ran out shouting that the child had been born. Eileithyia, startled, leapt up and uncrossed the spell. The knot broke. Heracles was delivered. Hera, discovering the trick, turned Galanthus into a weasel, which is myth's way of saying the whistleblower protection program needed work. From that day, Eurystheus used authority like a stamp and Heracles used pain like a passport. The Nemean lion became a pelt and a brand. The Augean stables converted sanitation into political theater. Clean a king's mess in a day and then renegotiate the contract. The Hesperides' apples turned distant property into a question of title. Every labor is a story, but every story is also an instrument, a public demonstration that Hera's recalibration of the clock had teeth. If Zeus's desire had authored a son, Hera's schedule published him in a genre of her choosing, epic under supervision. Notice the conversion at work. Heracles' greatness is never in doubt. What Hera engineers is the context that makes that greatness legible as service rather than sovereignty. A demigod who might have become an unanswerable prince becomes instead a contractor for the state sent on errands nobody else can complete. In another universe, one where Eileithyia did not sit at a door, the same strength would crown itself. In ours, it reports back. Of course, Hera does not get everything she wants. The labors refine rather than reduce Heracles. Each success pushes him closer to apotheosis. The ledger she keeps so carefully accrues columns labeled unintended consequences. But even there her influence persists. When at last Heracles is raised to Olympus, how does the palace settle history? Not by erasing the feud, but by marrying it. Heracles weds Hebe, Hera's daughter. We have seen this maneuver before. A chair that once bit back, an oath that turned flirts into fleets, tools remembering their makers. The reconciliation is real and also administrative, a long problem converted into policy. So the chapter closes where it began, with timing masquerading as fate. Zeus improvises, Hera edits. He announces with thunder, she annotates with clocks. Most myths teach that strength overcomes obstacles. This one whispers that schedules create them. Mortals recognize the lesson because they lived it. Bosses make promises, calendars make outcomes. And somewhere, in the quiet after a completed labor, while Heracles catches his breath and Eurystheus drafts another assignment, you can hear the faintest scratch of accounting, the ledger closing another page. It starts as so many global problems do with event planning. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis had everything. Guest list glittering, seating chart fraught, dress code immortal formal. Also, one small oversight, do not invite Eris, goddess of discord, which the host honored right up until Eris arrived anyway and rolled a golden apple across the floor like a lawsuit. Inscribed upon it, to the fairest, deadpan. The couple did not purchase wedding insurance for fruit-based litigation. 3 goddesses stepped forward because of course they did. Hera, who wears authority like architecture, Athena, who makes victory look inevitable, and Aphrodite, to whom inevitability frequently surrenders. Zeus, having learned the hard way that judging beauty is a hobby with poor survival rates, outsourced the decision to a mortal. Paris of Troy, a man with cheekbones and a shepherd's schedule. Mock epic flourish. The fate of cities will now be decided by a beach boy with opinions. Each goddess made an offer that might as well have been a policy platform. Hera promised power, kingdoms docile as well-trained dogs, borders that stay where you draw them, the bureaucracy that makes permanence possible. Athena promised victory, not merely the noise of triumph, but the reasoning that ensures you can do it again next season. Aphrodite promised the world's most beautiful woman, which is less a policy than a headline, but headlines have a way of steering policy. Paris, who would have made an excellent focus group, chose the headline, deadpan. Ancient decision science remains consistent with modern decision science. You can hear Hera's ledger opening even before the apple stops spinning. A mortal judge has humiliated a queen whose jurisdiction includes the contracts that make judging possible. Athena, slighted, now has a grievance with a return address. Aphrodite has made an IOU that will be collected in other people's blood. And Zeus, who prides himself on neutrality when it is convenient, has created a problem that looks deliciously like somebody else's. This is the part of the story that resembles an internal email thread you wish you'd never read. Helen is the promised prize, and Menelaus is the inconvenient husband. To manage the inevitable violence of suitors, the clever Odysseus had once engineered the oath of Tyndareus, obliging every man who courted Helen to defend the chosen husband's rights. The oath sat quietly in a drawer like a fire code until Paris abducted or was persuaded to escort Helen to Troy. Then paperwork woke up, stretched, and turned into fleets. Greece discovered that it had invented a maritime alliance while trying to avoid a bar fight. If you listen closely, you can hear Hera's cool satisfaction. Contracts may be boring, but they travel. Hera chooses sides, the Greeks, because Aphrodite's victory has the moral perfume of a prank, and because Troy now symbolizes the hazard of a world where prizes outrun process. Athena joins her for reasons both strategic and personal. Across the aisle stand Aphrodite, Ares on retainer, and the kind of romantic ideology that turns elopements into manifestos. Zeus announces neutrality, which in divine diplomacy often means, I'll flirt with outcomes as they arrive. Olympus descends into the oldest managerial split, principle versus passion dressed as uniforms. Meanwhile, mortals do what mortals do. They inventory grain, lash ships, and print slogans on shields. The war will be sung as glory but managed as logistics, wind permissions, ration math, casualty reporting. Here myth slides its scalpel under the skin of stories about love. Desire, when internationalized, requires supply chains. Hera understands this better than anyone. She will not throw the first spear. She will instead tilt the table, agitate winds, seduce Zeus into naps at inconvenient hours, whisper sense where bravado has choked it. Kings will credit valor. Auditors will recognize air cover from accounting. Paris's choice made a city briefly fashionable and permanently doomed. That is not irony, it is curriculum. Athena's spurned wisdom becomes Greek tactics, walls tested by patience, champions matched like legal arguments. Hera's insult becomes coalition discipline. Kings who do not usually share maps learn to color inside lines. Aphrodite's promise becomes battlefield messaging, a story about love, grand enough to set standards for poetry and poor enough to feed armies. A golden apple rolled through a ballroom. The world now rolls barrels to the beach. And somewhere behind the banners, the callbacks click into place. The oath that once kept suitors civil has become a dragnet. Compliance still means knowing which door is technically a window, but Hera has spent decades bricking up the windows. The chair that bit back lives on as policy. If you cannot stop an impulsive decision, design a system that punishes its downstream effects into usefulness. By the time the drums begin, Paris is still beautiful, Helen is still luminous, and a harbor full of ordinary men with ordinary faces waits for wind. Myth will immortalize a handful of names. Hera will remember the rest. War, which pretends to be about a woman, is always about what kind of paperwork a civilization trusts. The apple chose Aphrodite. The aftermath belongs to Hera. Glory is what poets sell. Permits are what wars run on. At Aulis, the fleet once stalled for wind as if the sky demanded paperwork. On the plains of Troy, the supply chain keeps humming while bards adjust the lighting. Hera and Athena do not swing spears so much as they tilt tables. Council days are their amphitheater. Agamemnon speaks, Nestor remembers, and somewhere behind the tent flap a queen of heaven raises one eyebrow and the wind obediently finds its manners. Deadpan. The War Office did not have a form for breeze favorable with light moral pressure. When diplomacy pretends to be chivalry, the gods take notes. Menelaus versus Paris, single combat to spare thousands. Steel flashes, the dual trends, and for a hot second peace feels plausible. Then Aphrodite does what romance always does when confronted by procedure, removes the boyfriend from the calendar. Paris dissolves into a private room with a private goddess. The truce dissolves with him. Hera watches the treaty evanesce like steam and files a moment under "Why We Don't Outsource" ends to headlines. Athena, more caffeinated, goes to work among captains who can still tell plan from posture. Elsewhere, the brand managers of Glory keep staging activations. Ares enters the field like a corporate rebrand of Rage. Louder uniforms, same product. Diomedes, with Athena in his ear, reads the terms and conditions, then proceeds to wound a literal war god. An outcome that suggests even deities should check their coverage. Ares howls like a city in audit season and retreats to Olympus to lodge a complaint with the CEO. Deadpan. Claim denied due to pre-existing condition. Hubris. Aphrodite fares no better. Nicked while extracting a client from consequences, she learns that battlefield messaging is not the same as battlefield armor. Hera's classic maneuver arrives on Mount Ida, where her strategy department borrows Aphrodite's sash, perfume as policy, softness as subterfuge. She meets Zeus, whose neutrality has always been a performance art, and turns the king of gods into a nap. The clouds go private. Operations pause, and for a small bright window, the Greeks enjoy an edge that looks like competence. Deadpan. Mount Ida was briefly reclassified as a no-meeting zone. By the time Zeus wakes, the minutes have already been written and filed. Underneath the heroics runs a current of dual diplomacy. Every champion's challenge is a backdoor to armistice. Every god's intervention is a patch that keeps the software of war from crashing into peace. Hera and Athena shepherd the Greeks toward patience, formation over fury, ledger over lyric. They are not anti-valor, they are anti-waste. When a plan threatens to devolve into a spectacle, they add a memo. Align supply with story, or the story will starve. Meanwhile, Aphrodite keeps the brand promise of beautiful reasons to do reckless things, and Ares provides the reckless things. Even Zeus's meetings become case studies. He convenes the gods, declares norms, then breaks them with the casual grace of a weather system. Hera argues process. Athena presents data. Poseidon threatens a wildcat strike. Hermes drafts the minutes with plausible deniability. The Olympian board never quite votes. It leans, and the world leans with it. This is not a failure of myth, it is its realism. Institutions rarely decide. They accrete. On the ground, soldiers discover the ordinary arithmetic of survival. Shields dent as promised. Rations arrive late but edible. Heralds memorize more funerals than names. The poets will distill this into honor, and honor is not a lie so much as it is a filter. Hera does not touch the filter. She adjusts the light. A nudge of wind here, a counsel there, a nap where it counts. Small acts at scale. If glory is the proclamation, governance is the footnote that keeps the proclamation standing. We are meant to admire Achilles. Hera arranges that the camp still functions when Achilles sulks. The strangest thing about this divine project management is how human it feels. A queen creates discipline out of insult. A strategist turns humiliation into policy. A team learns to treat the enemy's romance as a scheduling vulnerability. In the songbook, this is blasphemy. In the ledger, it's Tuesday. Hera's victory condition is not a statue. It is a process that survives statues. Athena's is not applause. It is a map that still makes sense when torches sputter. By dusk, the lines reform. Ambassadors rehearse speeches for tomorrow's maybe duel, and the sea practices being both road and grave. Olympus resumes its theatrical neutrality. The camps resume their measurable needs. If you listen beyond the drums, you can hear the quiet click of compliance closing loopholes. Every window that used to be a door now bricked to regulation height. The bards will sing that heroes shape the age. Hera will remember who shaped the minutes. Every siege ends the same way, with an accountant's question. How do we convert 10 years of declarations into one night of results? The Greeks chose an answer that reads like the minutes of a prank meeting that somehow became policy. A horse big enough to house an away team, and small enough to call a gift. The proposal sailed through because committees love solutions that feel legendary while requiring only carpentry. Deadpan. The Trojan firewall did not whitelist wooden mammal as an ingress method. Cassandra warned them, of course, prophecy as due diligence, crying that the gift was a mouth with wheels. But Troy had long ago outsourced credibility to spectacle. When a city needs a win, it loves a photo op. The horse glowed under torchlight, risks shrank under applause. Somewhere on a hill, Hera and Athena watched logistics masquerade as destiny. They did not design the horse, they designed the conditions under which a horse would be welcomed. Fatigue, pride, and a chain of command that had learned to prefer symbols to procedures. Deadpan. Terms of service. Do not wheel unknown large wooden objects into fortified spaces were regrettably still in draft. Night did what night does best, equalized. Gates opened, the belly unlatched, men breathed out 10 years at once. A torch rose, a city fell. It will be sung as vengeance and courage, and those are not lies, merely filters. Unfiltered, it was also operations. Signals timed to stars, runners rehearsed to silence, a dozen captains who had memorized the same clock. If Aphrodite birthed the story, Hera saw to its bookkeeping. Alliances kept from fraying until the moment fraying became a tactic. Troy's End is a gallery of unlearned lessons. Priam dying at an altar tells you what happens when ritual stands alone against procedure. Hecuba, howling, tells you what happens when a state confuses story management with risk management. Cassandra, dragged to a future she predicted, tells you that data without governance is just noise at a higher pitch. The gods swirl through, each keeping brand promises. Ares leaves a kind of signatures you can't clean. Aphrodite rescues Aeneas, a seed on 2 feet. Hera permits the escape because empires require future problems to look inevitable. Athena escorts the horse and, later, shepherds the sails of men whose maps will need amending. Inside the ruin lies the strangest victory, a workaround turned constitutional. From now on, every fortress will host a debate about gifts the way it hosts a debate about grain. Quartermasters will add a line to checklists. Verify interior volume of celebratory statuary. Priests will learn to bless with one hand and probe with the other. City councils will discover that compliance is not the enemy of glory, but the guardian of survivable glory. Callback. It is the old truth of Olympus. Compliance still means knowing which door is technically a window, except tonight the window rolled in on wheels and whinnied. What do the Greeks get for their trouble besides songs? They get admin, spoils to catalog, prisoners to process, oaths to renew before men drift home to find home rearranged. Hera's victory condition is not the bonfire. It is the ledger balance afterwards. Kings still speaking to each other. Gods still answerable to procedure when the drums stop. Athena's is a curriculum. Teach a generation that craft and cunning can finish what raw force cannot. Even the Trojan horse learns a bureaucratic afterlife. For centuries, it will serve as case law in the jurisprudence of siege. Not everyone is flattened. Aeneas walks out under starlight with his father on his back and household gods in his arms, an exit clause preserved by the very deities who unzipped the city. The future needs raw material. Hera and Athena are practical enough to seed it even as they finalize this chapter. From those embers, the Romans will later claim a destiny. From that destiny, the Greeks will claim a footnote. From that footnote, historians will claim a career. Thunder announces, ledgers endure. You've heard it before because it keeps being true. At dawn, the horse is a silhouette and then not even that. The shore is a mouth-chewing wreckage. Bards pick through the pieces for verses that make the appetite palatable. Administrators pick through for systems. What failed, what held, what can be taught to young cities with more enthusiasm than wisdom. The war that began with a party foul ends with a policy manual. Vet gifts, respect warnings, trust procedures more than declarations. If that sounds unromantic, that is because endings usually are, but kingdoms outlast kisses by memorizing checklists. Hera knows. Athena wrote some of them. Myths pretend to end when the hero poses and the chorus files out, but the real endings are municipal. After thunder has made its announcement and households have survived their weather, cities perform the ancient magic of turning drama into schedule. That is why the road to Olympia smells like olive and sweat and civic pride. You do not see Zeus hurling anything except wreaths, which is the point. Violence sublimated into rules, competition bounded by starting lines and finish beams. A judge raises a hand, a runner nods, the crowd becomes a temporary nation. Deadpan, no lightning permitted within stadium lanes without prior authorization. Across the sea, columns lift the name of Hera into air as if architecture were a kind of prayer that refuses to blink. Temples, Samos, Argos do not adjudicate gossip. They warehouse memory. People bring offerings that look suspiciously like minutes from a long meeting. Vows kept, babies safely born, quarrels endured without civil war. Hera's portfolio enters stone not as fury but as continuity. The queen who could not always command weather commands. Instead, the calendar, festivals that arrive, whether or not thunder feels like participating. If Zeus dramatizes beginnings, Hera specializes in again. The rituals encode what the bards only imply. Take Danaë, the law of hospitality that makes strangers temporary kin. Offer bread, pass the cup, treat the unannounced visitor as a disguised inspector from the divine compliance office. It is both kindness and policy, born from a world where the king of gods sometimes knocks wearing feathers and expectations. Deadpan. Mystery shoppers existed before malls. They just had better disguises. Break Zinaya, and you don't merely commit a rudeness. You puncture the social firewall. The ledger that Hera carries in myth becomes, in towns, the shared habit of keeping receipts. Who helped, who failed, who deserves an invitation next spring. Oaths behave the same way. On battlefields, we saw them drag fleets into being. In peacetime, they stabilize inheritance, contracts, markets. Swear by Zeus, and you are not invoking a personality. You are invoking the habit of not moving the goalpost mid-game. The Greeks were realists about this. They did not assume men would simply resist temptation. They built an atmosphere where lying felt expensive. The divine name was collateral. If you defaulted, you did not just disappoint Zeus, you offended the mechanism that lets strangers trust each other long enough to trade. Meanwhile, the arts performed their long audit. Vase painters pinned the disguises to clay, bulls and swans and clouds, but the scenes often include witnesses, attendants, onlookers, a hand half raised as if to say, "We remember what this cost." Dramatists rerouted private gusts into public questions. A comic chorus mocked imperial appetites with music. A tragic stage turned wounded dignity into curriculum. The theater was a school where citizens practiced disagreement with applause, which is probably the healthiest way to disagree. If you listen, you can hear Hera's cool arithmetic in the background, counting how many times laughter rescued the city from swords. Not that the gods retired, they diversified. Zeus continued to be useful wherever weather met law, seafarers, judges, hosts. Hera continued to sit in the spine of weddings and the hinge of births, but the daily miracle is that the human majority, lacking thunderbolts, learned to manufacture predictable afternoons. Markets opened, doors unlatched, children rehearsed names for future feast. The palace scandals did not vanish. They were domesticated. A chair that once bit back became a story you tell apprentices about tools with opinions. A window that used to be a door was finally bricked to code. If Olympus had a retirement plan, it would be called custom. Customs are how villages keep breathing when the weather forgets them. They are the slow heroism of repetition. Every spring, someone sweeps the temple stones. Every harvest, someone sets aside a portion for those who lost this year's gamble. You can dress this up as piety or efficiency. The labels matter less than the reliability. People stay because staying has choreography. So this is how myths end. Not with the hush after a thunderclap, but with the creak of shutters every morning, the chalk squeak of a scribe writing down who brought the oil, the soft friction of a ring slipped onto a hand while a priest murmurs, a name that is both queen and concept. Zeus remains the headline. Hera remains the ledger. Between them, the city learns a difficult grace to translate appetite into arrangements and to treat arrangements with enough reverence that appetite doesn't have to wear feathers again anytime soon. The stage did not retire when altars cooled, it simply changed uniforms. In tragedy, Zeus and Hera lose some feathers and gain gravity. Playwrights like to test institutions by wounding them. Hera becomes the ache behind oaths, the wince that accompanies a promise spoken too loudly. Zeus, emptied of disguises, becomes the weather of authority, those sudden changes in pressure that make citizens look up from their errands. Deadpan. The chorus functions as a compliance department that sings. When rulers in tragedy brag, lightning tends to rehearse nearby. Comedy performs the opposite surgery. It turns Olympus into an office with excellent eavesdropping. Zeus is the manager who announces open door while inventing new windows. Hera is the senior administrator who knows which chair still bites back if you sit without reading the memo. The jokes work because they are not about gods. They are about habits. Laugh at the swan if you must. The punchline lands on favoritism, office romance, and the eternal truth that performance reviews can be postponed but not escaped. Deadpan. Budget meetings existed before coins. They were just called festivals. Philosophy is where the gods become grammar. Plato sharpens them into forms and arguments, allowing Zeus to moonlight as a metaphor for law or mind, while Hera moonlights as nomos, the social contract that refuses to be charmed. Aristotle, who dislikes thunder as a management style, keeps what can be measured, ritual as social glue, oath as credit instrument. Even skeptics who doubt the literal swan keep the lesson. Desire will find a costume. Law must learn to recognize it. The upshot is not unbelief but translation, myth rendered into policy the way music becomes sheet notation. Then come the Romans who never met a system they couldn't repurpose. Jupiter keeps the lightning but trades some romance for jurisdiction. Juno acquires a matronly iron that fits an empire with census data and paved roads. Where Greek Hera tallied private costs, Roman Juno Regina tallies civic ones. Marriage as demographic policy, festivals as scheduling software. The Capitoline triad seats theology like a senate. Deadpan. Under Roman procurement, thunder is a public utility with service-level agreements. If this sounds unpoetic, visit a triumph. Poetry loves an empire that runs on time. Branding follows the power lines. In Hellenistic courts, Zeus's image acquires a touch of CEO realism. Bearded, composed, the kind of face that can approve budgets. Hera's gaze migrates from marital insult to matronal stability. She becomes the patron of the long afternoon where nothing collapses. Coins circulate this PR, Jupiter's eagle, Juno's scepter. A temple freezes what plays once scrambled. The bull is reduced to geometry, the swan to a motif that designers deploy when a pediment needs a story without a scandal. Yet beneath the new gloss, old infrastructures keep running. Oaths still collateralize strangers, Xenia still polices doorways, festivals still put time on a leash. Law courts quote precedents that are, in effect, mythical. Beware of gifts on wheels, beware of decrees with clocks you didn't set, beware of kings who mistake weather for law. Citizens who have never seen a thunderbolt learn to sense the difference between a command that announces and a rule that endures. That distinction is the true survival of Zeus and Hera, not statues, but reflexes. The arts remember what policy forgets. Poets smuggle the double vision into epigrams. Sing of the cloud that looked like a lover and the oath that made it costly. Vase painters tuck in witnesses, not because they saw, but because someone always pays. Dramatists keep Hera's ledger as a stage direction. Enter consequence, unamused, and allow Zeus his entrance only when he clarifies the stakes. Neither god requires belief to perform their civic function. They require audience rehearsal, the habit of recognizing glamour and asking what it will cost on Monday. Sometimes the afterlives peek at the present with indecent accuracy. A city votes for spectacle and wakes to spreadsheets. A leader speaks in thunder and delegates the ledger to a woman people call stern until the roof doesn't fall. Deadpan. Posterity prefers boring survivors to dramatic losers. When children learn proverbs about hospitality, when merchants balance their books, when judges hesitate before stretching a statute, you can hear the faintest murmur of Olympus. Hera counting. Zeus clearing his throat. So yes, the swans become ornament and the bulls a logo. The essence remains. Appetite dresses up. Order keeps receipts. If the Greeks gave us the stories and the Romans the filing system, we inherit the reflex to ask whether the beautiful solution is also a sound procedure. Somewhere, a chair remembers to bite gently when someone forgets. Suppose you remove the marble and keep the motions. A leader who prefers announcements to systems. A partner who prefers systems to announcements. A family business that must survive both. That is Zeus and Hera without feathers. And it is also the meeting you had last Tuesday. Deadpan. The agenda item miscellaneous is where thunder usually hides. We keep telling their stories because their choreography persists. Desire still arrives in costumes, startup, initiative, pilot program, and still expects doors to admire it. Order still checks the hinges and asks how much the costume will shed on the carpet. When the show dazzles, someone must write the aftercare. Who cleans the stables? Who counts the ships? Who interviews the witnesses? Our literature softened the names and kept the jobs. That is an afterlife more durable than belief. There is also an ethics tucked inside the satire. The myths mock Zeus not simply for appetite, but for evasiveness, the refusal to admit scale, the habit of outsourcing consequences. They honor Hera not for resentment, but for the civic virtue of remembering. Memory in this scheme is not nostalgia, it is risk management. To hold a ledger is to insist that beginnings count only when endings have something to stand on. Deadpan. If your plan requires a swan, your plan needs a spreadsheet. So what do we do with the more troubling episodes, abductions that become crowns, vows that become loopholes? One answer is to curate them like volatile chemicals, labeled, ventilated, taught with gloves on. Another is to watch how communities turn them into guardrails. Gifts on wheels get scanned. Kings don't set clocks alone. Hospitality includes the right to say no. The myths are not permission slips. They are procedures written in theater ink. Moderns inherit the running jokes. We say Trojan horse and mean audit failure. We say Pandora's box and mean scope creep. We mutter that a meeting of the gods is happening and mean no one wants to vote. And when an elegant chair snaps at a rushed sitter, when tools push back on users, we grin because the workshop of Hephaestus never closed. It migrated into our offices as specs and standards. Callback. Some furniture retains counsel. It is tempting to demand a verdict, to crown Hera right and Zeus wrong, or reverse it for better pyrotechnics. The Greeks were wiser and, frankly, more patient. They suspected that order without appetite dries into bureaucracy, and appetite without order floods into harm. Their dramaturgy proposes a truce. Let ambition drive, but make it obey traffic laws. Let memory keep score, but let it also marry solutions when they appear, the way Hera married Hebe to Heracles and turned a feud into a festival. The ideal is not purity, it is governable weather, which returns us to the roofline of a city at dusk. Any city that balances noise with norms. A storm mutters beyond the hills. In kitchens and offices, people finish the day's reconciliations. Money counted, dishes dried, receipts tucked into quiet drawers. Lovers quarrel and draft treaties. Children ask ridiculous questions that are, in fact, the right ones. A priestess locks the temple. A clerk turns off the lamp. A poet crosses out a swan and writes policy. The gods, if they are anywhere, are in the habit. And you, listening, get the last assignment. Where in your life do you prize announcement over arrangement? Where do you need a ledger to keep your thunder honest? Where might a chair be warning you to sit with care? The myths have already done their half of the work. They have named the motions. The rest is administrative, deadpan. Submit your form by close of business. Extensions require divine approval in triplicate. Court was called at dawn because justice enjoys dramatic lighting. Themis, robed in a color that suggested thunderclouds with better manners, struck a staff once, and the room learned silence. On the plaintiff's side sat Hera, queen, ledger in her lap. On the defense, Hermes, tie slightly askew in a way that reads as innocence on mortals and strategy on gods. The gallery filled with witnesses who were also exhibits, a bull polished to museum shine, a swan that refused to make eye contact, a golden rain memorialized in a bowl that looked like it regretted its career choices. Deadpan. The bailiff confirmed that precipitation would be allowed as evidence if it promised to remain in its container. The clerk read the charges. Count 1. Evasion by costume, to wit the use of fauna and weather as workarounds to consent, protocol, and basic furniture. Count 2. Externalization of costs whereby private adventures generated public crises. Abductions that became crowns, oaths that became wars, births that required calendars to commit perjury. Count 3. Contempt of procedure, defined as treating institutions as suggestions and suggestions as storms. The bench asked whether the defendant wished to be addressed as Zeus or by any of his aliases. Hermes answered that his client preferred your immediacy. Deadpan. Motion to strike granted on grounds of nausea. Hera rose without flourish. Her voice did what queens' voices do when they have spent centuries explaining the obvious to people who do not wish to be explained to. She did not cite feelings. She entered exhibits. Exhibit A. Europa, a girl meets a bull and wakes up on an island with a dynasty on the way, leaving behind a kingdom that learned how a rumor can be a border. Exhibit B. Danaë, architectural virginity defeated by weather, which is not how walls are supposed to work. Result: a hero with a severed head for a policy tool and a grandfather hiding from prophecy inside his own shadow. Exhibit C. Leda, ornithology as coalition building. Egg becomes interstate treaty. Years later, the bill arrives as hulls and ashes. Hera's gaze did not waver. The disguises are not quaint, she said. They are devices, and every device leaves maintenance. Themis asked about damages, and Hera opened her ledger. It was not a book, it was a choreography. She traced columns that mortals learned as custom. Zenaya to armor doorways against surprises wearing smiles. Oaths to keep princes from editing obligations mid-emotion. Festivals to domesticate thunder into again. This, she said, is what it costs to live with brilliance that refuses to budget. The courtroom shifted, as rooms do when someone names the thing everyone has been pretending is a metaphor. Hermes stood, the kind of standing that makes even skeptics curious. He did not deny, he reframed. Your Honor, he began, the sky does not apologize for being large, it announces. The question is whether the announcements were empty. They were not. He tapped the bull, the swan, the bowl. These became institutions. Minos learned law from a wave that answered. Perseus taught politics how to face terror without staring straight into it, which is also how one survives a council. Helen, the headline you all despise, coerced kings into a coalition that, for the first time, discovered the power of shared logistics. Hermes smiled the way messengers smile when bearing uncomfortable gifts. The disguises, Your Honor, were not deceit, they were accelerators. Hera's eyebrow moved a millimeter. Accelerators, she repeated, tasting the syllables like medication. Yes, they accelerate the need for me. A stir of laughter, rude, affectionate, frightened. Hermes bowed. Precisely. May it please the court to consider Hephaestus, a child throne finds a workshop and creates compliance with teeth, a chair that bites back so that apologies can be negotiated into policy. May it consider Eileithyia, delay as a civil instrument, not vengeance. May it consider the Trojan horse, a workaround trained into case law. He spread his hands. My client is not innocent. He is useful, which is the closest Olympus ever comes to innocence. Themis leaned forward the way mountains lean when they are considering an avalanche. And the harms? Hermes did not blink. Recorded. Paid. not always by the payer, which is why we have courts. He gestured toward Hera's ledger with the respect of a clever thief for a perfect lock. Her Majesty's book is not an accusation, it is the user manual for living with weather. The judge dismissed the room for a recess that tasted like verdict. In the hallway, swans pretended to be statues and statues practiced not laughing. Somewhere, a clerk updated a memo that should have been written centuries earlier. Compliance means knowing which door is technically a window and when to brick the window to regulation height. When the gavel called them back, the air felt like a held breath with paperwork. The bailiff announced Athena, and the room straightened as if posture were evidence. She did not swear on anything. She defined it. Power without placement is weather, she told Thames. I have spent centuries placing things. She described councils that almost held, formations that nearly forgot themselves, heroes who required a map more than a pep talk. In each case, she said, Hera supplied memory. I supplied method. Zeus supplied momentum. Deadpan. Momentum is very helpful if you already know where you're going. Hera inclined her head. Hermes smiled as if the word momentum had been his idea. Cross-exam. Hermes. Lady of strategy, would you deny that the spark often precedes the plan? Athena. I would deny nothing so obvious. I would simply invoice it. Ripples of laughter. A scribe underlined invoice in the minute. Athena's eyes became the kind that draft policy while you blink. Charm may open a door, she said, but charm cannot write a fire code. That is what Hera keeps. Your Honor, see Ledger Exhibit 12. Themis nodded. The ledger looked heavier. Next witness. Dionysus entering like a festival that had memorized when to stop. Laurel, ivy, an expression of rescued sorrow. Your Honor, he began, I am what happens when desire is burned and then pardoned. He told the court how grief had fermented into rights, how masks let pain speak safely, how cities learn mercy by practicing ecstasy under rules that look suspiciously like guardrails. Hera watched him with the exhausted tenderness of someone who knows that leniency requires staffing. Hermes asked, would these liberations exist without my client's initiative? Dionysus swirled a cup. Wine begins with fruit, he said softly, but somebody still has to bottle it. Deadpan, labeling a requirement apply even to miracles. Then Hephaestus, soot in his voice, precision in his gait. He did not perform limping, he performed leverage. I built the chair, he said, and every spine in the gallery remembered how wood can vote. Not because I love traps, but because apologies without architecture are weather reports. He described furnaces that turned chaos into fittings, fittings into terms, terms into the modest glory of permanence. Hermes, gentle now. And the day you released your mother. Hephaestus's smile had the clean edge of a file. The day policy replaced begging. Hera's throat moved. Thamus let the silence stand like a column. For the record of harm, Hera called Io. A shimmer crossed the air and became a woman whose story still remembered hooves. She spoke without embellishment. The fear, the flight, the gadfly that turned continents into corridors. It is true, Io said, that I reached Egypt and a kind of peace. It is also true that peace should not require such mileage. Deadpan. No further questions. The map already answered them. Hermes rose slowly. Lady Io, did any kindness sustain you? Yes, she said. Mortals with xenia in their bones, your client's better laws, not his brighter afternoons. Hermes regrouped with craft. Let us admit the pattern, he told Thamus. My client accelerates beginnings. Queens and craftsmen stabilize the aftermath. The system works. Hera's eyebrow committed a tiny coup. The system is expensive, she said. Do not call it working unless you intend to pay. She gestured to the ledger again. Oaths, rituals, chairs with memories, windows bricked to regulation height. These are not decorations. They are the invoice for disguises. Thamus weighed the room with the patience of seafloor. Counsel, she asked Hermes, do you contest the cost? Never, he said lightly. I merely propose they are worth it. Athena interjected, unusual but aloud. Worth is not a feeling, she said. It is a ratio. Show us the denominator. A murmur, half delight, half dread, tickled the rafters. Even the swan seemed to reposition itself for better acoustics. The final flare came when Hera pressed the point of consent. Doors exist, she said, for a reason. Hermes countered with the old sophistry. And windows? Hera did not blink. Windows are for light, deadpan. The courtroom updated its architectural glossary on the spot. Themis scribbled something that might have been philosophy or building code. Very well, the judge said. We have heard of sparks and schedules, bottles and labels, chairs and their ethics. We will now hear the defendant. Gasps rinsed the gallery. Outside, the weather looked up from its paperwork. When Zeus rose, the ceiling remembered its vocation. His voice arrived like a forecast that had rehearsed its sunshine. He would not pretend to be a clerk, and the world should be grateful. He was announcement, the unschedulable beginning, the spark that keeps maps from growing bored. Then he turned to Hera with a respect that felt like weather clearing and admitted a simple geometry of power. Beginnings need places to land. The queen provides the landing, and the house stands because she insists on floors. He did not deny the bull or the swan or the rain. He named them as sailors, named storms after surviving them. Each disguise argued that life exceeds paperwork. Each consequence argued that paperwork keeps life habitable. From his sparks, Athena carved method. From his heat, Dionysus poured mercy. From his carelessness, Hephaestus invented chairs with opinions. Even the throne, if thrones could speak, might add that no warranty covers teeth. Hera rose only to ask a single question that matters: the costs. The pause Zeus allowed was the most honest thing he had said all day. Counted, he answered at last, though not always by him. Themis lowered her gaze to the ledger on Hera's lap and then to the lightning at Zeus's feet, as if weighing seasons. The gavel fell with the sound of a mountain deciding. Weather is not law, and law without weather performs for itself. Thunder may continue to announce, but only under probation by procedure. Invoices will be due, signed, and stored where memory can find them. A clerk read the terms in a careful voice that sounded like poetry trying not to blush. First came the consent clause. Windows are for light and doors for people. The defendant will stop entering by windows while pretending they are doors. Then came disguise reporting. Planned metamorphoses must be filed in advance on a form politely called Hypocrisis 42, with a clear plan for risk and cleanup. If an emergency makes filing impossible, a written account follows within 1 lunar month. The room breathed like a harbor that had finally learned tides. The Cassandra provision arrived next and settled like a compass. Prophetic warnings must be heard in full, transcribed, and answered in writing. Silence shall not masquerade as consent. Hephaestus will audit thrones, gifts, and statues for hidden hollows and for bite potential, and the case law of wooden horses is adopted as binding precedent. Eileithyia safeguards join the list with a steadier light. Influence over birth is allowed only for public health and not to rig destinies as if they were games played with clocks. Any action likely to mint new oaths, wars, or festivals requires Hera's countersignature. In her absence, Athena may act, and Hermes will keep the minutes that no one reads until it is too late. Xenia remains enforceable. Those who violate hospitality will forfeit wind and good fortune, and will sit through a seminar titled Gifts Are Not Loopholes. The clerk noted with admirable restraint that failure to comply may result in temporary conversion to non-conductive material. Even the swan stared at the floor like a former ornament, learning humility. Zeus inclined his head, the royal version of a signature, and for once the thunder waited its turn. Hera stepped forward and co-signed with a neatness that could balance a city. Hermes accepted the role of monitor and promised copies in triplicate. One for the record, one for the rumor, one for the gods to misplace and later rediscover. Themis returned the bolt to Zeus and the ledger to Hera and set upon them both the lightest shimmer of accountability. The way sunlight reminds water that it can be measured and poured. The court dissolved the way weather dissolves when it remembers it has somewhere else to be. Artifacts resumed their lives. The bull rehearsed becoming consolation. The swan practiced reflections that behaved. The chair settled back into its vocation of advising posture and, when necessary, history. Far from the courtroom, cities began living the verdict without hearing it. Gifts were scanned for hollows. Warnings were written down before they could be forgotten. Receipts were kept with more tenderness than shame, and procedures learned how to breathe. Priests rehearsed blessings that understood checklists. Captains taught crews the grammar of doors and the etiquette of windows. Judges paused before moving goalposts. Lovers made promises and, astonishingly, calendars. The news traveled in a quiet way, through habit more than proclamation. It is a relief to learn that weather can be beautiful and house-trained. Zeus will go on announcing. Hera will go on balancing. Themis will keep time. Hermes will file something clever and legible. Outside, a cloud tried itself on and then thought better of it. Streets brightened, shutters clicked, and work resumed with the soft authority of routine. We, ordinary heirs to an extraordinary quarrel, keep translating appetite into arrangements that last the night. That is the sentence the city prefers to wake to. Thunder announces, ledgers endure.